Emir's Education in the Proper Use of Magical Powers by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Chapter 4. The Convention of the Gods and a Message to Emir. The preparations for the convention were in full swing. There was so much commotion that Emir forgot his problems, even though he tried to remember them. By now, however, the excitement was almost unbearable. Emir tried to be everywhere at once, to see what was happening. He didn't want to miss anything, but the gods worked so quickly, and he was so slow by contrast, that sometimes he nearly cried with frustration. Skymaker was more godly than usual. The convention was being held in his domain. The main decorations were up to him, and he had his god apprentices so busy and they moved so fast that Emir hardly saw them as they rushed by, godly blurs, swirling like silvery winds. "I want 1,000 new skies," Skymaker said to them that morning, "each one different. Some with 1 moon, some with 10. Use your originality. Now, get to it." His black beard shook when he laughed, and his sky-blue face turned the most vivid azure, and all the apprentice gods clapped and cheered. They made so much divine noise that Emir thought he couldn't stand it for another minute. Skies were hanging up to dry everywhere. The landscape god was as busy as Skymaker. There were sampled deserts, mountains, thousands of different trees, plants and flowers, and with the other earth gods developing new creatures to go with it all, there was lots of confusion. When the time for the convention finally came, the floorboards rumbled with giant footsteps as gods arrived from everywhere, their thighs taller and thicker and more splendid than the largest tree trunks. They came strolling into the universal arena, and their chuckles and booming chatter nearly shook the stars out of Skymaker's new skies. There were night skies and day skies hanging side by side. There were skies with red sunsets and gloomy dark clouds, and skies with dawn lights, and skies all orange with autumn suns. Just to be safe, Emir stood directly under a sunny sky. He didn't know if the stormy skies would actually rain or not, and he'd left his umbrella on his boat. When all the gods started arriving, Emir yelled up at Skymaker. "Everyone is so big," he complained. "Their voices are so loud that I can't tell what they're saying. They're so tall that I can't see their faces. And suppose someone steps on me. Not that they would, but they could." "Gods never step on people or anything else for that matter," Skymaker said. "But come." And before Emir realized what was happening, Skymaker made a small shelf at the horizon end of the nearest sky, and sat Emir on it. "There, now you can see and hear everything, but you mustn't interrupt, of course." "I won't, I promise," Emir answered. "I won't budge an inch either." "What if I fall down?" "You won't," Skymaker said, "but I'll ask Groundmaker to make a comfortable, soft, grassy hill just beneath you. Then even if you did fall, you'd hardly feel a bump." And Skymaker rushed away. Emir looked down and down. He was very high in the air for him. Worse, Groundmaker sent word that he was too busy to make a small hill for Emir. So Emir just sat there, dangling his feet, with his red slippers and stockings waving in the breeze that blew from the nearest sky, the tiny bells on his slippers jingling and jangling. Emir didn't know how long it took for everyone to settle down. There were giant murmurings, rustlings, and gargantuan coughs. There was the rattling of thousands of papers being taken from divine briefcases and the arranging and rearranging of godly robes. From his sky seat, Emir was just above the level with the gods' faces, but they shone with such vitality and goodwill and extraordinary good health that he could hardly look at them head on. So he tipped his own head in one direction or another and squinted. First, there were lectures or opening statements of one kind or another. Emir tried to listen, but the rhythms of the giant vowels and syllables and the rocking cadences of the gods' voices were too much for him, and he slept through the whole thing. He wakened to divine applause, so shattering that he thought he'd never be able to hear anything again. The clapping of all those hands stirred up the air just enough to make Emir's one earring swing back and forth so quickly that it hurt his ear. And when he shook his head, the earring fell off. It dropped all the way down to the floor of the divine auditorium, landing on a sample tree, and caught on the lowest branch where it looked like a tiny insect or a bit of dew. Emir thought of jumping down to get it, but he was up too high, and besides that, something else immediately captured his attention. He saw the weirdest looking animal that he'd ever seen. A creature god stood beside it, saying triumphantly, "This is a dinosaur, a huge reptile with wings." There were some divine catcalls. One god yelled, "That creature will never fly, wings or not." "Let's give it a chance," shouted another god. The creature god bowed slightly. Emir found it very confusing to look at this particular god because he seemed to be a combination of an animal, a person, and a god all at once. His body was covered with beautiful thick silver-gray fur, but his face was the face of a person who resembled a cat. The creature god wore purple robes. He gave a whisk of his royal arm, snapped his fingers, and suddenly the dinosaur came alive. It gave a shrill, almost crackling roar, lifted its fantastic wings, which in turn lifted the great scaled body, and it rose in the air, circling the gods' heads amid thunderous applause. Emir felt the closest sky tremble with the motion of those tremendous wings, and he breathed a sigh of relief when the dinosaur settled down again. "I told you it would fly," the creature god said. "The landscape gods already have developed plans for its environment. All we have to do is decide which world to put it in." "Oh, put it in mine," Emir said silently. He thought that the dinosaur was the most fascinating creature he'd ever seen. But it was so big, he thought, that there'd never be room for it in his father's kingdom. One god disagreed with all the others. "I still think it's a funny model and not dependable. I bet it won't last for long," he said. But the creature god said with dignity, "Every creature that we can imagine has a right to live. And I imagined this one. Since I imagined him, there was something to be imagined." "Bravo!" shouted the other gods. The creature god put his papers away in his briefcase and sat down with a divine, satisfied smile. Emir could hardly sit still. He was so excited. The gods were more than gods. They were magicians. Before his eyes he saw them produce new creatures and new versions of just about every animal he'd ever seen. But the world showing was incredible. The arena was cleared, and in the center a giant projection screen reached so far in all directions that Emir couldn't see the ends of it. Then the skies were darkened, and not one star or sun or moon showed. In the middle of the darkness, light suddenly filled the projection screen, with pictures more splendid than words could say. Emir gasped. It seemed that 1,000,000 worlds, each with its own creatures and lands, flashed before his eyes. He couldn't keep track, of course, but he could make out some things, and he saw that each world had its own time, too. Some had nights and days, some had one or the other, and some just had an in-between. In some worlds it always looked like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Emir knew this, even though clocks hadn't been invented yet. Emir never did know how long all of this went on. He forgot all about his father's kingdom and its problems. He even forgot about his earring, though once he looked down to see if he could see it, but he couldn't. The gods were having refreshments while the demonstrations went on, and once Skymaker very thoughtfully handed Emir a glass of nectar, which tasted like all the fruits in the world, but like no one fruit that Emir could remember. Emir didn't even know that gods could get nervous, but suddenly there was a profusion of divine coughs and throat clearings. Robes were arranged and rearranged. Skymaker suddenly began making quick adjustments to his skies, straightening a star here, adding extra glitter to a moon there, and everyone stopped talking. "What's happening?" Emir asked. The gods were so quiet that Emir's voice was heard all over, or it might as well have been, because 1,000 gods at once said, "Hush." "He just might make it this time," Skymaker whispered. "Who?" Emir asked in the quietest voice he could manage. "The God of all life. The God one in many," Skymaker answered. At once Emir remembered what he'd came to the land of the gods for, and all the problems that he'd forgotten rushed back into his mind. He sat up as straight as he could, and straightened his clothes, and touched Skymaker's sleeve. "Do you really think he'll come?" Skymaker started to answer, and then his blue face turned ever bluer, and he stopped speaking before he even began. The gods and goddesses all oohed and awed. Then they were so quiet that they might as well have been statues. Emir knew at once when the God of all life appeared, even though he really didn't appear at all, because he wasn't like the other gods who looked like creatures or plants or people, only far better. The top god, as Emir thought of him, took the form of everything else, and usually he stayed in the background. Now suddenly he really let himself be known, which meant that each god, animal, plant, or people god, was instantly 1,000 times more godly than just the minute before. The God of all life was really more like a light than anything else, and the whole divine arena just lit up as if a universal spotlight was turned on from the inside of things, bathing every visible object. Everything Emir saw was lit up as if even the blades of grass had bulbs inside them, though bulbs haven't been invented yet, or spotlights either. Still, a new kind of superlight splashed out over the arena. More than this, the light itself was somehow kindly and alive, as if the God of all life was everywhere at once, made of light, but with a presence inside that was invisible. And a voice came without sound. That is, Emir heard the voice in his head, and so did everyone else. All the trees rustled at once. All the tips of new grass twirled. The dinosaur moved his massive wings, and in one way or another all of life answered when the God of all life spoke. But strangest of all were the words the God spoke. "I have a message for Emir," the God of all life said. "I'm God, one in many." And thunder rolled through 1,000 skies, and stars left their places. It was the most spectacular show Emir had ever seen. "Who is Emir?" the gods asked each other. In the meantime, Emir tried not to be frightened, even though the skies were so noisy. He saw that the skies were really just dancing, even if they did make such a racket. "I have a message for Emir," the God of all life said again. For Emir. Most of the gods had never met Emir, of course, and they repeated his name all together. "He's not a god at all, is he?" they asked each other. "Here I am," Emir shouted, and every god's eye looked his way. He was very embarrassed, but this was the chance he'd been waiting for, and he just had to speak. "I'm Emir," he said again. Then everything and everyone became so quiet that Emir had trouble remembering what sound was like. The message from the God of all life, the God of one and many, began to come within Emir's head. Words that really weren't words, sounds that didn't make any noise, but had colors that burst like firecrackers inside his mind. These exploded in reds and yellows and purples and other colors that Emir had never seen before. Was that the message? Emir kept thinking. This is my chance. I've got to ask about my father's kingdom and its problems. I've got to get an answer that I can understand. And while the colors in his head were brilliant and really quite extraordinary, what did they have to do with his questions? A picture of his father, the king, came into his mind, and he thought of the tiny crowded kingdom with everything growing right up to the sky if something wasn't done. Emir thought desperately again, I've got to get a definite answer. He held his breath and then whispered, Dear God, one and many, dear God of all life, you've got to tell me what to do about my father's kingdom. If I go home without an answer, my father will be angry and he'll never send me on a mission of any importance again. And as Emir said this, the whirring pictures replaced all the lovely colors in his mind. He saw all the people in his father's kingdom, and they were so disappointed that they wouldn't speak to him at all. So in real desperation this time, Emir cried silently, God of all life, I demand that you do something to help me out. The minute he thought the words, he was sorry. He knew, without knowing how he knew, that the God of all life had withdrawn. Slowly, Emir opened his eyes. All the earth gods were watching him. What was the message? Skymaker asked in a hushed voice. I don't know, Emir said miserably. You don't know? Skymaker, astonished words were picked up by all the gods, so that even wisest frog read them in his book of the universe. Emir shook his head. I wanted to ask about my problems so badly that I forgot to listen, he said. He forgot to listen. Unbelievable, the gods murmured one to another, shaking their own divine heads in amazement. Emir stopped to catch his breath because he was trying hard not to cry. I guess I finally demanded that the God of all life do something to help or give me a definite answer. He looked at the points of his red slippers because he didn't want anyone to see his face, which was very crestfallen. Skymaker said sadly, "You mean you had your chance and you muffed it." "But I came here with one important question," Emir cried. "It seemed like the most important thing in the world. And what will my father say? He hates quitters, but he hates stupidity even worse." "The God of all life has his own way of answering questions," Skymaker said. "I'm sure that his message could have solved your problem even if he didn't mention it by name. And you just can't demand, Emir. Nobody likes to be told that they must do something, God or not. Besides, it isn't even polite." Emir looked so unhappy that Skymaker said more gently, "Don't you remember anything? Maybe you got the message and don't realize it." Emir shook his head again. "No, I don't remember anything but beautiful colors, and I don't remember any words at all." "You did learn an important lesson, though," Skymaker said. "You learned the importance of listening." By this time, Emir was so upset and disappointed that he shouted, "I didn't want a lesson. I wanted an answer." He stamped his foot, and the bells on his red slippers jingled angrily, and all the stars in all the skies twinkled in Morse code that said, "You'd be far better off if you'd listen more and didn't talk so much." Emir didn't know Morse code, which again hadn't been invented yet, but he got the message. But he thought, "Oh, what will I tell my father when I get home?" He stared around him. Skymaker's skies looked dark and dingy, and the grass didn't sparkle any more. The gods themselves looked like shadows. Emir gulped and looked hard. The gods were turning into shadows. Just before they did, he heard Skymaker's voice say clearly, "The message of the God of all life is in all of nature, everywhere. If you really listen, you will hear it. So all is not lost. And here is something that you thought you lost." And Emir's earring was suddenly glittering at his feet. His little boat, the Feather, was beside him too, newly painted with Skymaker's favorite color, blue. There was only one sky again, and his coconut shells were filled with new stores of honey. But none of this helped much. Emir wondered how he'd get home, for though his boat sat right on the shore of the ocean, he didn't remember what direction he'd come from. He tried not to think what his father would say, and he wondered if he'd ever see the land of the gods again. "Goodbye, dear Skymaker," Emir called, but no one answered. In Chapter 4. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.